Farmers who don't own the land they farmed are generally called peasants. That's a word that's not in this chapter right now, but we'll get to it. All right. Anyway, your book has a song here about the Lord of Heaven. And again, it's not addressed to any one God, just addressed to heaven. In other words, heaven hear us, heaven help us. The Ming Dynasty was replaced by the Qing Dynasty. That's spelled Q-I-N-G, but pronounced Qing. And your book then talks about a couple of the greatest rulers of the king, and I want to promise you, those names will not be on the test. I mean, you've got Kang Si, I'm guessing pronunciation. If any of you know better how to pronounce these names, you're welcome to. And then there was another one here. Again, those essentially, what I remember is they started out with a couple of capable rulers, and eventually the king, like the other dynasties, also fell. Anyway, there came the Westerners. The Europeans, they came from two directions, to the north and west. The Russians came in, and the Portuguese were followed up by the French, the Dutch, the English, and the Spanish, and they wound up, all of them, wanting to claim a share of the territory in that area. Now, to make a long story short, the French were to wind up with what we called French Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, and the Dutch wound up with the East Indies, the Spanish wound up with the Philippines, and the British wound up with India. And as for China, well, we'll talk more about that in later chapters. They wound up not conquered, but they wound up being partitioned by various European countries. And your book speculates for a while, how much did Western influence bring down the Chinese? A lot of persons will say the Chinese would have been brought down anyway. Others say, well, the Westerners enhanced and helped bring the Chinese down. What went on with the Chinese? Well, one of the things now that caused the Chinese to decline late during the Qing Dynasty was a period of time called the Little Ice Age. And folk, this lesson might be somewhat timely. Now again, I don't know how much any of you have any opinions on this, but the Little Ice Age was the same phenomena that brought a population decline in Europe. It also brought about a population decline in China. China's population initially declined. Again, the Ice Age meant that the crops that they'd grown for generations would no longer grow as well. And that led to starvation. It led to lower resistance to disease. We don't know for sure what caused the Little Ice Age, but some of the latest research I've read on it, it says that it might have been caused by the sun cooling down. Now, at one time, scientists said, anathema, no, the sun never changed its temperature. Now we know that every star we observe for long will eventually change its temperature, and our own sun, its output is not constant. That this change might have been due to sunspots, which we'll talk about in chapter 18. Galileo, the European, was the first person to see sunspots. When there are fewer sunspots, the climate cools. When there are more sunspots, the climate warms up. Now, does anybody know what the sun is doing at this moment? Yeah. The sunspots seem to heat it. I know what you think the sunspots have to do with cooling, But from what I've read, is the sunspots actually heat things up, and a lack of sunspots cool things down. The sunspots are not cool areas in the sun. In fact, well, actually, I don't know if we know what causes them. But does anybody know what the sun is doing now? There are almost no sunspots observed. And the climate. I mean, this should be obvious to those of us in North America. The climate is changing, all right, for the pool. Now, that's a highly controversial point, but the climate was warming. I mean, hey, I have no doubt the climate was warming. The cooling began in the year 1998 when the warming started to level off. But even so, from the time we got our first satellites in orbit where we could actually measure Earth's temperature until 1998, the climate had only, the Earth's average temperature had only warmed up a 0.4 degrees or 0.4 degrees. Then it leveled off and maybe going back down. Again, we don't have records that go all the way back, so we can only speculate when we start talking about things back that far. Anyway, the Little Ice Age ended. By the 1700s, the climate started to warm up again, and it was to keep warming up apparently until 1998. The climate started warming, and when the climate started warming, China experienced the reverse of what it had before. They experienced a population explosion. And this population explosion is something that has affected them till this day. Now, it wasn't that Chinese families were having more babies than they had before. What caused the explosion was that a higher percentage of these same babies were now growing up. And it's believed that it was due to 2 or 3 factors. Number one, food was better, thanks in part to the climate warming. Also, the Chinese were able to import foods from other countries that gave them nutrients that their own foods lacked. And the invention of the smallpox vaccination that occurred about the year 1750. Smallpox, you may not realize, was a scourge of mankind. It just destroyed high percentages of many populations. Well, the smallpox vaccination greatly held the disease of smallpox in check, and the Chinese are known to have used it. With these factors together, you have a higher percentage of babies growing up, and then these young people who grew up and produced more babies, and this led to a fast rise in population, which the Chinese were not prepared to deal with. Now, if you look at the demographic map of China, and notice I said demographic map, you might notice that most of Chinese people are concentrated in a small area. Not like the United States, which is not much bigger than China. But in the United States, our population is scattered. We have our own less than populated area, but our population is scattered. All from East Coast to West Coast to Massachusetts, New York, Philadelphia. In fact, the area between Washington and Boston is almost one continuous city. You can go from Washington to Boston without getting in the countryside. But then you go into the Midwest, you have big city around many big cities around Chicago, the Great Lakes region, and many big cities around Florida and big cities around New Orleans. I'm trying to scatter. Our population is scattered. The Chinese population is all bunched up together with most of its land sparsely inhabited, and they wound up, they could not handle the population explosion. And this has become a problem even in the year 2014. Industrialization, again, in view of what's happened to us, that's important. Your book devotes a small time talking about they began to industrialize. And then your book speculates, that's part about page 488, was the Chinese economy just about to take off? Now, granted, we know it didn't, but was it on the verge of just taking off and the people becoming wealthy and rich, industrialized, and the takeoff stopped? Again, this is something we wonder what might have been, what could have The religion of the Chinese at this time was Confucianism, named after a great scholar, I'll call him a sage, Confucius, who lived close to the time of Socrates, around 300 BCE. And Confucianism seemed very adequate for the Chinese up until this time. The Chinese said, well, Confucianism must be the world's greatest religion because after all it has made us the greatest people on earth. In fact, we're so good and so great we don't need to learn anything from anybody else because we have it all. But here is a problem that every group of people has, and a problem that you folk will face and I faced. You grew up in your parents' home, most of you, and your parents taught you as best they could right from wrong. Then you get out in the real world, and all of a sudden the values your parents taught you are challenged severely. What does that apply to this? Quite a bit. The Chinese people, all of a sudden, they became aware of the rest of the world, and some of their values seemed inadequate. And folk, everybody faces it, and every religion faces this, whether it be Islam, Hinduism, Christianity. How do your values stack up when measured against the yardstick of the measuring tool of the rest of the world? And every group of people has in some ways found themselves coming up short. With the Chinese, it was no exception. Europe was valuing such things as industrialization, mechanization, and China was left behind with an economy that was based on farming. And we're talking a little bit about other areas of their life that just seem to be inadequate when measured up against standard performance. Family. The Chinese called you a member of the same family if you were descended from the same great-great-grandparents, that is, on your father's side. In other words, you had your father, his father, which would be your grandfather, great-great-grandfather. So you would be living in the same, not maybe under the same roof, but in the same community with persons who were descended from your great-great-grandfather. They would be your family. And of course, when the next generation came along, the family would split up. But to this day, they still base their family unit on a great-great-grandfather, what we might call the extended family. And this was necessary because the main crop, rice, called for a community of people to put